Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're looking very hard at how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we've got a really special conversation. I think we've got Tim O'Reilly, who Tim is technically the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, but Tim is way more than that. Tim is, I think, one of the bona fide kind of leading thinkers of kind of the tech intelligentsia in the Bay Area for the last several decades. He's been instrumental in opening the world up to open source software and the kind of open kinds of systems. He was great at rebooting the kind of frame off the dot-com crash into the Web 2.0 kind of concept. He's been introducing tech into government and the government 2.0 kind of framing, and his most recent thing he's been focusing on is the Next Economy Summit. He had one last year, he's going to have one this fall. That's really fundamentally rethinking the future of work and really the economy going forward. So it's really great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I like to say my reputation exceeds me, but I am passionate about thinking through this next economy.
Well, so let's start with that. So you are one of the few people we could actually start the big picture and move it down. There's a ton of anxiety out there. We're seeing surfacing in politics with the rise of Trump and Brexit. We're also seeing it, happening in terms of just folks are worried about the rise of AI and robotics and displacement around the economy. And so, yet you see that tell us what you see is going on in the big picture here of what's happening in the economy right now.
It's pretty clear that we've made some big mistakes. But it's also clear to me that if we play our cards right, we have a fundamentally optimistic set of possibilities in front of us. One of the things that I've been focused on lately is Keynes's wonderful 1930 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. You realize this is something he's writing at the outset of the Great Depression. And he's predicting that, there's going to be so much productivity that people won't even have to work anymore. Now, we didn't do that, but if you had talked to somebody in 1930 and explained to them what it was going to look like in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they would have been astonished. And going back further, you think about the Luddite Rebellion of 1811 to 1813. These guys are smashing looms. Mm-hmm. Did they imagine that their descendants would have infinitely more clothing made by these mechanical looms than even the richest aristocrats? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did they imagine the descendants of those machines would take us to the moon, would mm-hmm. fly us around the world in a heartbeat, something that would take years? Did they imagine that if you'd said to them, we're going to dig a tunnel under the English Channel, over to France. So the whole point is that technology lets us do things that were previously impossible. And yet there's a narrative that we're facing today that technology is destroying jobs. Mm-hmm. And there's two things to note about that. Technology is destroying jobs, but only because we have told it to do so. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have told it that people are a cost. Mm-hmm. We have told it that people should be eliminated from the system. There are a set of choices, and we have actually built incentives into our economy to encourage those choices. Mm-hmm. My friend Rana Foroohar wrote a book recently called Makers and Takers. Mm-hmm. It's called the subtitle is The Rise of Finance and the Decline of American Business. Mm. And it really focuses on the fact that we've optimized our economy over the last 40 years for the stock market.
And when you say we at that context, what do you mean by that?
Whether it's true globally, but it's true in the United States in general, and it's true in Silicon Valley as well. And if you think about it, when we made a series of moves to align CEO pay with stock performance. And stock performance over the long term, would be a really interesting measure, perhaps. But over the short term, it's a terrible measure. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And not only that, it overweights one of the many factors that goes into having a successful economy. I like to, actually, I've been imagining lately, what if we had an AlphaGo for the economy? You know, we heard the stories about how AlphaGo, played millions of games against itself and figured out new strategies. But you can kind of see
this is the Google, just to explain it.
The DeepMind's AI that effectively beat the world's greatest Go player, and it did it with applied AI. And again, this is obviously a much more complicated problem. I mean, Go is some simple rules leading to in amazingly complex outcomes. The economy, of course, is millions of rules and inputs leading to complex outcomes. So it's much harder to model. But just as a thought experiment, I like to talk about the Walmart problem. So just to kind of understand the trade-offs that we make in our economy. Walmart heirs are among the richest people on the planet. In fact, it's kind of funny because they talk about Bill Gates as the richest man. But actually, if you look at the 4 Walmart heirs, each of them is not that far behind Gates. So, Sam Walton made an ungodly amount of money. And, and yet Walmart workers are paid so little that when they apply for work, they're given also an application for government food assistance. And it turns out that the government food assistance dollars that is spent on Walmart workers, which is then spent at Walmart, is roughly equivalent to the difference between Walmart workers' wages and a $15 minimum wage. So effectively, what we've said is, okay, it's okay to cram down the workers in order to pump up the stock value. And we're going to subsidize this with taxpayer dollars taken from the public. And then we're also going to give back a chunk of economic value to society in the form of consumer surplus, the cost of goods going down, the cost below what they could be, what you could charge for them. So there's these really 4 factors, and yet we're really optimizing just for one of them. And all of the incentives in our system say, like if you are the CEO of Walmart, cram down those workers, offload the costs to society onto the taxpayers so that we can get the stock price up. And give benefit to consumers, in the form of lower prices, because that will actually help to drive our market dominance. So it's this is a game, this is a strategy, and a lot of people, I think, sort of assume that the way the economy that's revealed in that discussion is sort of like the natural law of the economy. Rather than realizing that it's a product of a set of rules. We have a particular tax rate on capital. We have a different tax system for labor. We have rules about what kind of social safety net is required. For example, things like at 30 hours a week, you have to be paid benefits. So that's led to a lot of low-wage employers saying, well, great, we'll just make sure that people can't work more than 30 hours a week, so we don't have to pay them any benefits. This was something I talked about last year in this whole discussion of, what's wrong with, low-wage work. People have focused so much on the on-demand economy, but they haven't realized that if you're a low-wage worker in America, you're managed by an algorithm that's trying to make sure you don't get too many hours. At least on the the side of on-demand companies like Uber, you can work as many hours as you want to try to make the amount of money that you want. Now, of course, it's an utter failure of the system that we're still not actually solving for, hey, how do we make this work for people? And I think that there's a really interesting awareness that's starting to grow, which is that Nick Hanauer, I think to his credit, was one of the first people to articulate this really forcefully, which is that, as he liked to say, if we don't, pay people, well, actually the way he said it to me the first time we met was, if only one thing makes a business successful, and that's customers. And we've been screwing our workers for so long that they can't afford to be our customers anymore. And and you see this recently in Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan saying we've got to raise the wages for our lowest paid workers. There's starting to be an awareness of this. For a long time, businesses just outsourced that problem to government. Well, we'll just pay people not enough to live on, but the government will take care of them. But we don't want to pay taxes.
Exactly. No, that's interesting. Well, so you're kind of describing, just to schematically think about this, the economy we've kind of learned to
that's right.
to love or hate over the last 30 years, or however we want to do it. But there's also this next economy that's happening, of which the sharing economy is part of. And so talk to me a little bit about what's happening under the surface, or what's happening here, and we can get deeper into the sharing economy, but there's something bigger that's moving here.
Well, when I think about, what's the design pattern that we should be optimizing for? What does that look like? I call the current economy the WTF economy. It's like, WTF is this great expression because it can be an expression of wonder, or it can be an expression of dismay. And in today's economy, we see both. The WTF, oh my gosh, that's possible. With self-driving cars, with drones, with AI, there's amazing new stuff happening. And then you really don't pay people enough to live on? WTF, And so the next economy has a design pattern, I think, which is rather than using technology to cut costs and simply to drive down the cost of labor, and other things that in fact do make a company more productive, we actually ask ourselves, what does technology let us do that was previously impossible? And so often that technology consists in augmenting people so they can do new things. And you even see this with Uber, for example. We had connected taxi cabs for years. But all they did was put a credit card reader in the back and a little TV screen where they could show you ads. And nobody really said, well, what could we do differently? How could we do this differently with technology? And then Uber came along and said, wow, everybody has a smartphone that's identifying where they are in real time. We could match up drivers and passengers in real time. Not only that, there's all this mapping technology, so drivers who aren't that experienced can help find their way around. Not only that, we can build an online backend that will multiplex all of this possible world of passengers and drivers. This is technology augmenting people so they could do something that was previously impossible. And of course, that actually grew the market. The market for on-demand transportation is way bigger than it was before that. And so that's great. The downside is that Uber didn't throw off the notion that workers are a cost to be eliminated if at all possible. They started out with, well, we're going to produce really high wages, and then they started cutting. And the question is, what's the right balance between paying workers and paying stockholders? And kind of going back to my Walmart analogy, it's pretty clear to me that we have that balance way off. Let me give you, not just the Walmart example, but the Apple example. Apple paying people so little to make iPhones, so you had suicides at the factories. This is sure, it's on the other side of the world. We don't really care about that. Well, we should care about it because what did Apple do? The notion that somehow if you don't cram wages down to the lowest possible level, you are not going to survive as a business. Are you serious, Apple, with your huge cash hoards, your most profitable company ever? And you end up saying, well, we have so much cash, we have to give some of it, billions of dollars to Carl Icahn because, he's a stock market player. And, again, it's this whole acceptance of this bizarro world where we don't have enough money to give to workers, but we have billions and billions and billions of dollars to spend on stock buybacks to improve the stock price for Wall Street managers.
So do you think
Yeah.
we're in a moment of a fundamental rebalancing that's potentially going on here in the next 5-10 years or something?
Yes, I think the political, and economic situation is starting to get critical enough that we are going to see either some very bad things or we're going to see some very good things. And I think, looking back at the lessons, going back again to the Great Depression and what followed from that, a couple of things I think. First off, the government did put in place a safety net, and that's what most people think about. But the government also made massive investments in the future. Mm-hmm. Louis Hyman, is a friend of mine, wrote a new book about the history of debt, and he's also written quite a bit about the Great Depression. He just talked about this the other day. America went from being 10% electrified to 60% electrified in 10 years. Mm-hmm. That happened in the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. I always think about that too. The Golden Gate Bridge was built in the Great Depression.
I was just on it today.
The Empire State Building was built in the Great Depression. But more than that, when World War II came around, we completely reinvented American, business, where resources were diverted over a period of 5 years from industries that were into new areas that didn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's when aluminum smelting got off the ground. It's when, aerospace got off the ground. The aerospace industry, became this huge industry as a result of that. And I sometimes think that actually it's going to be climate change that's going to rescue us from our current economy. A big challenge where we go, holy shit, we can't keep on going with business as usual. Mm-hmm. But it could also be that we end up in a terrible situation like we did with World War II, with pretty serious kinds of conflicts that lead to us having to completely redo our economy. And I'd sure as hell like to get ahead of that. And I think anybody with any sense should like to get ahead of that.
Right.
There's so many lessons from history. You go, couldn't the damn folks in the, those nobles in the French Revolution see what was coming? Couldn't, those people in the, who kind of crammed down Europe after the First World War, see what the consequences would be? And yet, we're kind of running like half-witted Gadarene swine right down the same, kinds of crazy paths. And so I'm kind of saying, no, we need to get on a different path. And that different path starts with think about things that need doing. Think about how technology can help us do those things. Reinvent the economy so that it works for everyone. And that really requires some really deep thinking, and this on the order of what we did, in the New Deal. It requires thinking that is bold and investment that is bold. And so anyway, so back to my event, what I'm really focusing on are really these two stories. One is how do we use technology to do things that were previously impossible? And then secondly, let's assume that we get to a world where technology is used, the fruits of productivity are given to society, in the way that they are through consumer surplus. Mm-hmm. But let's just imagine the machines get better and better at doing what we do, what humans do today. Mm-hmm. What will happen to all of us? Mm-hmm. In one dystopian vision, we have a class of wealthy people who are living, these beautiful lives surrounded by vast slums of people in a global underclass. Mm-hmm. In another world, we have the 21st century equivalent of a prosperous middle class. Mm-hmm. And what are they doing? Mm-hmm. And it sort of strikes me that we actually see signs of this in our cities. Mm-hmm. And it's really around the creative economy. Mm-hmm. And
what do you mean by the creative economy?
Well, I mean it much more broadly than the arts, which is what people usually take it to mean. Think about what makes a city great. There's great places to go eat. Every restaurant is part of the creative economy. Mm-hmm. And the fact that a great restaurant charges more than a little hole in the wall is a kind of creative premium that says, oh yeah, of course we pay more for that human touch, that skill, that art. Why do we pay more? You can get very cheap clothing, at the Gap or Old Navy or wherever. But people go to these expensive boutiques. Again, it's the creative economy. It's the creative premium. And so I think that there's a, and then of course it's also evolving into what we would traditionally call the creative economy, which is becoming much more of a peer economy. Where there are people who are spending a huge amount of their media consumption time on peer-produced media. Whether it's social media or YouTube or so many other forms, and we're slowly building an economy there. There's more and more money starting to flow through to creators on those in that economy, and I think we can see even more of that. And so I guess I'm trying to paint a vision forward for, okay, let's assume that we were to reallocate some of the profits of the economy from the market to society as a whole. Kind of using this imaginary, AlphaGo equivalent that's sort of saying, actually, what is the winning strategy for societies? Right. What is the best strategy? And I think we would find that it is, yes, continue giving rewards to capital. Yes, continue giving rewards to consumers. But it would also say, but you can't. You also have to give rewards to people working, and you also can't. You either have to pay taxes, to do that redistribution, or you have to have it come out in some other way, because if you don't, you are going to end up in this, bad end game with only some people able to afford products, and everybody else is living a pretty miserable life.
A couple ways to go here, but let's layer from then, again, this whole series about the sharing economy.
Yeah.
The sharing economy, I'm assuming it is an overlap there with what you think of as the creative economy. But again, thinking of our audience, how would you explain the rise and the kind of current situation of the sharing economy in that broader context that you so masterfully laid out?
Well, I think that first of all, there's several drivers of the sharing economy. There's some good ones and some bad ones. And this is why it's, again, this WTF economy you hear again and again. There's so many wonderful reasons why people participate in the sharing economy. One of my favorites is a story that my wife heard somewhere in the Midwest of a guy who was I believe a chemical engineer or an aerospace engineer who didn't feel like he got enough human contact at work. And so he would leave early in the morning, 2 or 3 hours early for work, and pick up, be a Lyft driver, and donate the money to charity. He didn't need the money, but he wanted the human contact. You hear stories of how people who are between jobs, or there's a wonderful fill-in aspect of it. People saying, "Hey, I had a lousy job, and this is better for me." Or even
in the home sharing context, is there what's the
well, absolutely. I'm not quite. Certainly there are people who who do it again purely because they have to. They can't make ends meet. But there are other people who, for example, may have a second home that they want to share, or they're traveling. I think of my brother actually, who's found that what he can get for his home in Palo Alto is so great that it's an incentive for him and his wife to travel a lot, because they actually can pay for the trips on the rents they're making. They're going, why not just go, be away from home? So there's a whole lot of kind of wonderful sort of interesting stories there, but there's also a profound sense that some of this is rooted in the fact that people don't have enough to get by on. And but I also see some interesting hopeful signs. For example, that if you look at the competition between Lyft and Uber, one of the focuses of competition is increasingly on who's better to drive. And that's a good thing.
Who's better to drive for?
Who's better to drive for.
Yeah.
And Lyft has played that card, I think, very well. I think they're a more fundamentally idealistic company. But I also think that that's really a good sign that there's a little bit more power. There's going to be a little more power for labor. Over time, for a long time it was just like people are coming in. The churn, I think, at these companies is 60% a year. And they go, well, there's always going to be new drivers. Well, until there aren't, or until the quality of the drivers goes down. And I like to think that, one of the really interesting loci of competition here, needs to be figuring out how to take driver retention, driver satisfaction into account, as well as consumer satisfaction.
Into the algorithm.
Into the algorithm. Yeah, I mean, right now the algorithms are set up to optimize for pickup time.
Consumer.
Yeah, consumer pickup time. But just as Google, started out with a fairly simple search algorithm, and they added more and more factors, and it got better and better for a variety of reasons. I think that Uber could be going, oh, well, actually, driver retention, we'd actually be better if we optimize the algorithm for drivers as well. And I think the question, though, is whether the companies will do that themselves, or whether there is a role for government, which has traditionally been, kind of the backstop, for this kind of thing. But for that matter, I mean, what are the vehicles by which workers get a voice, and a seat at the table? I love this line from David Rolfe at the SEIU. We were talking, and he said to me, God did not make being an auto worker a good job. Those jobs that we look back at in the 60s were the product of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by people who amassed worker power and then used it to get a seat at the table. Now, it's funny because I grew up in an era where the corruption of unions was their dominant face. But I've come to have a great deal more respect for unions in today's world because for all the things that are still wrong with them. Hey, there's a lot wrong with business too. And it's pretty clear that we need a counterbalance because it is a multiplayer game, and we need advocates, for, workers. We need advocates for capital. They're pretty good advocates for themselves. But we need, and we need advocates for society as a whole. But we also kind of need a moral revolution in business, a moral revolution that isn't about do-goodism. It's a moral revolution that's about the right way to do things. And what I mean by right, and this is really kind of goes back to sort of ancient philosophy. I'm an Aristotelian at heart. And Aristotle described virtue as the control of the appetites by right reason. And that means you've kind of thought this thing through, and you've actually figured out what is the thing that will make you the happiest, and what will make everybody the happiest. And we actually need to go back to that and realize, oh no, this notion that simply satisfying the market, the market, is not the right answer, and it's not the right answer for a really important reason. That the invisible hand market that everybody likes to think they're describing, is the market of real goods and services. Where I do something for you and I trade it for something that you do and that I want. But so much of what we think of as the market today are financial markets, which are a betting pool about what people might want. And they're all about perception and the manipulation of perception rather than meeting the real needs of society. And so, because those two markets have increasingly diverged, even if you're a, quote, free market fundamentalist, you have to realize that the market that we are living in is it's distorted by government intervention, it's distorted by the rules which then corporations play against government, against people. And so when I say a moral revolution, I mean a revolution in which we are trying to figure out what really works for sustainability for the long term.
This sounds like we had John Battelle in another forum, this What's Now forum, when he laid out his kind of NewCo vision, but it's very similar.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're traveling on parallel
you
paths.
guys are, well, but I think there's something there, which is why there's something bigger going on here. So let's talk about those three stakeholders, because what we're talking to in this, which should mean, let's say, government, workers, and business. Now, one thing I'd like to push back to you on the.
No, so I actually very clear that. Well, there's government, there's business, there's workers, there's consumers, and then there's actually probably the fifth one, which really needs to be distinguished, is financial markets, because it's super important to remember. If you could drill one thing into everybody's head. I first got this from my friend Bill Janeway. He actually was talking about what he called a three-player game between government, business, and financial capital. But he was the first one who, to my knowledge, at least for me, made the point that the business, the real business of goods and services, and financial capital are not the same thing, and that we've made this huge mistake by using this one term, the market.
Yeah, good point.
For two things which are so very different with very, very, very different incentives. Sure. Carl Icahn is doing nothing for the market of real goods and services when he buys a bunch of Apple stock. Apple does not need any capital from Carl Icahn whatsoever. And yet somehow he's managed to extort Apple into doing share buybacks, rather than lowering prices or giving more to workers, because we bought into this mythology that feeding the market is somehow, what keeps everything going.
Okay, well, you're a player in the tech circles, business circles, as well as the venture circles. What is the mentality in those two? Do you think there's an opening in those two sectors for saying, you know what, this isn't right. We want to do something different. We want to pay more than our fair share. Maybe some magnanimous gestures of like, you know what? Let's help drive this rather than just kind of react to the rules that are essentially.
I don't think that it's. I want to stay away from the idea that it's magnanimous. If you think about it, for a long time, and there still are companies that operate this way. One of the rules of business was charge as much as you can. Right, and there's this sort of the sense of the demand curve. There's a magic point at which the price and the demand are in balance. But there are companies that we see this very much in the government market, but also in the enterprise market in general. Companies that are charging way more than they should for services. I think of one conversation I had with a city official who was knowledgeable about technology, described a negotiation with Oracle, where Oracle came in saying, well, $17 million, and he knew what it should really cost, and he said his counter was $1 million, and they settled at $1.5 million. And the fact that Oracle was asking $17 million for something they were willing to sell $1.5 million for, is a sign of that old mindset, right? That you charge as much as possible. Yet along came a class of companies that said, oh, actually the way to get business advantage is actually to have prices as low as possible. So Walmart, Amazon, who've kind of pushed always for lower prices to increase market share. And so we then went, oh, wait. Of course, and there's a whole market of people who said, well, we can actually do better than that. We'll give away our services for zero, and we'll charge someone else to support our business. So we shifted from a model that said the only way to get ahead is to charge, some kind of monopoly rent higher than market price. That's how you get really successful. To one where we said no, charge less. That's how you become really successful. And I think we could have a similar point of view that said, oh, you know how you get really successful? You pay people enough to afford your products. That actually makes society as a whole richer, and people have more to spend. And there's starting to be a recognition of that. It's not magnanimity; it's common sense.
Yeah, I like that.
It's and you look around at all the things that are going wrong in society because we say, oh, we're paying too much taxes, but so often the people who are complaining the most are paying the least in taxes. Actually, I had a very funny interaction with one tech magnate who was never spoken to me since. It was sort of a little Twitter point where he was, I won't mention any names, but he was sort of ranting about, taxes. And I kind of just, on impulse, I went to Yahoo Finance and I kind of looked at his financials. and I looked at his competitors' financials, and I went, wow, they're all paying an average tax rate of high 20s or 30%. He's paying 12%, and so the guy who's paying the least is complaining the most.
That's wow.
And I think that's often the pattern.
But see, that's what people's feeling is that, the tech folks, they won't shift, or the VCs won't let go of these insane 10x returns always on the same. There's a kind of a sense like, but you're feeling that there is a shift in mentality happening, and there will be a kind of a sense of
let me put it this way. First off, that is the VC model, and I have to say, when I when I criticize Wall Street, I criticize the financial players of Silicon Valley just as much. And for anytime someone has a startup for which the principal goal is an exit, I don't see them as that different from the Wall Street guys who were trying to package up bad loans and hope that somebody bought them before they blew up.
Yeah.
There's way more of that in Silicon Valley than we admit. Like, to me, the great companies are ones where somebody says, I want to do this. I want to do it for a long time. I want to make something happen. You see this at a company like Google or Facebook, where people who are billionaires are still working away at this thing because they weren't trying to get an exit. They were trying to make something happen. I think Silicon Valley needs to look in the mirror, particularly in these bubble times. There are a lot of people who never set out to do anything other than raise money from venture capital, and then hopefully at some point flip the company and then do it again. And that's basically playing again in the financial roulette markets rather than the real market. Now that doesn't, there's obviously a lot of gray areas in between, because it can be a useful technique to bootstrap a company to, get something that you later figure out what the real business model is. But I like to encourage people to really think about, what makes a real business, and that's why with our indie VC approach at OETV, my venture fund with Bryce Roberts, we're really focused on companies that are looking to achieve positive cash flow because they're actually selling real stuff to real people, and they can be around, and sure, maybe they're going to have an exit, but they don't depend on an exit. They don't depend on just getting another round of financing, selling this company on to some future bidder. They're building something that should exist. Now, by the way, there's a great line I saw from Sir Martin Sorrell, who started WPP, the world's largest ad agency, which is, I think, I hadn't realized the WPP stands for Wire and Plastic Products. It's a shell company that they bought. He bought, and he put $375,000 of his own money in to buy it originally, and he's built this thing up to be this huge multi-billion-dollar business. It's a small amount of. But he had this great line. He said, "Being an entrepreneur means risking your own money, not someone else's."
That's correct. Threw it out.
Yeah.
Okay, so focus a little bit on the tech and business crew. What would you say about government, folks in government, and particularly people at city government, which is a lot of what we're talking about? Do you see, what's your analysis essentially of the receptivity to change, and what is the kind of sense of advice you might give in terms of, particularly around the sharing economy, but in general, this whole transition?
Well, the first thing I would say is when we're thinking about regulation and public policy, the first thing to think about should be, what are the legitimate social goals of any regulation? What are you trying to do? And let's be really transparent about that. For example, I recently landed at Newark Airport, took a lift into New York City. And I asked the driver, I said, so do you when you do this, do you pick up in New York? He says, oh no, I can't do that. I have to go back to New Jersey. Now you go, what, and this is this, they've effectively recreated some of the same territoriality that they had for taxi companies, which is basically, you go, well, what's the public policy goal there? It's protectionism. And That should be super clear. Let's lay out there and say, okay, we as a city have decided that we want to protect our industry. Okay, does everybody agree that this is the best public policy, outcome? What are some of the other alternatives? And so, for example, you would look at, say, well, we want to reduce congestion. We want to, protect consumers. We want to get the best prices for consumers. We want to have the drivers, we want to improve their income. And if you think about that particular example, none of those other objectives, which are far more legitimate, are being met.
Right.
So that's the first thing. Be clear about what your objectives are. And there's actually a really wonderful new tool that I've been investigating called Polis, POL.is. Basically it's a public policy debate tool put together by a guy named Colin McGill. And they did actually in Taiwan, they ran a process where everybody from the cities through Uber all kind of participated in a public debate about what the legitimate goals of public policy were, and they came to a set of solutions that I think everybody was quite happy with. So I think that there's some new tools for having sort of open, informed debates about public policy. But so I think on the one hand, you have the cities who have to be really clear about what are they trying to accomplish. And also we need to realize that not one size doesn't fit all. There may be some cities, for example, where they say, okay, we could use a lot more housing, in certain neighborhoods for people coming in because it will improve our tourist industry. This is a great example for Airbnb. And I think when I think about the benefits of Airbnb, I don't just want to stay in a hotel. I may want to stay in a different part of the city, or I may, I go, up to the Yuba River, and I can stay in an Airbnb in Nevada City. There's a cheap motel, a couple of old school B&Bs, but Airbnb gives us these wide range of wonderful new opportunities. So your city like that, you go, yeah, we want some more Airbnb because it'll bring more people in. Clear public policy objective. You want to support this. There's other places where you go, well, we don't have enough housing for our residents. People are being gentrified out, and people buying second homes, and turning them over for Airbnb rentals is actually contrary to that public policy objective. And so, if you're clear about what the objectives are, then I think you can have a much more informed discussion. But then the second piece is how do we use data on both sides more effectively? Some years back I wrote a piece called Open Data and Algorithmic Regulation. And in it I made the point that regulation has become a bugaboo. Everybody goes, oh, regulation. But that's because regulation is interpreted as a set of rules. But in fact, we live with all kinds of regulatory systems that we love. Just try, driving a car without the regulatory system of your carburetor, or your fuel injection system. Think about, the regulatory system that we call the autopilot that flies us around. I learned really interesting. I was on a flight recently where I was talking with a pilot, and it's like, we in a busy airspace like San Francisco, we can't actually fly manually in and out of the airport because the tolerances are too tight. You got to do it on autopilot. Crazy. You think, oh well, don't you do at least the takeoffs and landings on autopilot? No, actually, that's sometimes the place where they most use the autopilot now. Crazy, But the point is, here's a regulatory system. It works. We accepted it because it works. Credit card fraud detection, right? We're being monitored, and we accept it because it's protecting us. Anti-spam, a regulatory system. Google search quality, a regulatory system. So what do all these regulatory systems have in common? They actually have a clear objective, kind of what I was talking about earlier, that everybody's agreed on. It can be imposed unilaterally. Google says, here's our regulatory system. We want to have the best search results. We want people to click on the top result and go away happy, right? And at least that's the theory of it. And Uber has a regulatory system. They say we want people to be able to pick up in 3 minutes, right? And the question is, so are there other factors that we could take into account?
Right.
And my sense is that if we could get, first of all, the clear, statement of here are the outcomes that we're going for.
Yeah.
Then you start measuring, are we achieving those outcomes?
Yeah.
And I love Google search quality as a model.
Yeah.
Because it's something they've written a lot about and they talk about. But things like just wonderful signal, like short clicks and long clicks. This idea that if somebody clicks and goes away and doesn't come back, that's a long click.
Yeah.
If they they click on a result and they come right back and then click on the next one, that's a short click. A short click means they weren't happy with the results, so it gets demoted. So they built this wonderful feedback loop, and that kind of feedback loop dynamic, which we've really mastered in Silicon Valley. It's all over. So it's what drives Google, what drives Facebook, what drives any of these modern apps, where we have the data that's feeding back to making the service get better and better as people use it, is so largely absent from the way that government does regulation.
Well,
and so what I would love to see is, I'd love to see a partnership between cities and the services they want to regulate, where there is real shared data, shared visibility, clear objectives. So the city, for example, says, okay. Oh, and by the way, credit card fraud detection is another really good model of a regulatory system in which government actually doesn't micromanage. It simply said, hey, guess what, guys? You only get to charge the consumer for $50 of bad debt. And all of a sudden, it becomes the credit card companies' duty to regulate. Right. And so the question I have, and I don't know what the right answers are, but like if you were thinking about how would I regulate Airbnb, how would I regulate Uber and Lyft, how would I regulate any of these companies, I would be asking myself, what are those interventions that will squarely put the shoe on their foot? And like a good example of this like if cities wanted to come down on the side of labor, they would say, okay, we're not going to tell you how much you can charge, but we're going to tell you that you can't go below this amount. This came to me one day reading an article about Uber's rates in Detroit. And Travis does a lot of hand waving about the perpetual ride and how great it is. And they go, well, at one point they were offering drivers 30 cents a mile in Detroit. And just a simple thought experiment to me said, okay, well, let's assume that with the perpetual ride, I get, 30 cents a mile. Maybe I'm going 30 miles an hour. That's $9 an hour before expenses. I go, your city could say, no, your rates have got to, add up for the perpetual ride at the very least, or whatever, for some, percentage utilization, to this amount. You go, and sorry, you can't go lower than that. There are ways, we're so stuck in, we have ideas like minimum wage, and we go, well, we don't know how to apply these in a world where, it's on demand and people work for multiple people. You go, sure you can. You could go, yeah, we're gonna say, we want to know what your typical utilization rate is. We want to know what your per mileage rate is. And at that utilization rate and that mileage rate and whatever else fees, this is what it is. You could do some back of the napkin math and come up with some rules, right? Yeah. And then you go, okay, and we're going to periodically audit those rules. And if you're not paying enough, you're going to have to pay back pay to drivers. There's a bunch of ways that these guys could intervene much more creatively than, oh, you can't pick up in New York City if you're from New Jersey. That's just stupid.
Yeah, that's right. So really what we're talking about is the difference between pushing these square pegs into these round old holes from the old system, or getting creative and really thinking about how to...
Yeah, what are we really trying to accomplish? Yeah. And also really trying to get to a meeting of minds. I do think that there are real challenges. One of the things that I think, again, really muddies the water is the lack of financial literacy on the part of so many people, where they confuse market value with profit and loss, for example. How many times have you seen, Uber is worth, $60 billion, they're so rich. You don't know what their actual profitability is. They're losing billions of dollars a month in some markets. So the question is, what's the actual profit and loss there? And so it's sort of interesting, to kind of, how would we kind of back off a little bit, because sort of the notion of, well, Uber's sort of screwing its drivers because they're worth so much. That's a totally different system of money.
Right.
It has nothing to do with whether they're succeeding as a business. At some point, if the stock market stops, giving them money, they could be out of business. If we don't know that though. And so again, I feel like, it's sort of harder right now in a world where so many of these companies are private so late. When companies are public, that's why, again, go back to sort of Walmart as an example, where it becomes very, very clear that, Walmart is shoving, costs off onto society, and capturing it for its shareholders, when in fact, would Walmart, they might be less valuable, but do we really, would somebody say, oh, I wouldn't want to own Walmart if they were, if they were only making $15 billion a year instead of 20? That's silly. If you think just, what it would do is it would depress the stock price, and who does that actually affect? And you go, well, of course it's the, all the shareholders, and you go, well, how much of that is sort of pension funds, and those are ordinary people? Well, it turns out a lot of the pension funds, they're making all their money on. They're making all their money churning stuff anyway. It's like if they were in Vanguard or some other index fund, they'd be doing a lot better for people, and they wouldn't have to be pushing so hard for, we need to have the stocks keep going up and outperform.
Right. Well, so just to finish this thing on the government though, because as we're winding down here, you spend a lot of time with people in government. You ran these whole Government 2.0 conferences. When you look at the next couple of years here around city government, state governments, even federal government, do you see some kind of potential big shifts happening in terms of regulation or kind of categorization of workers, or are we in a window here of kind of fluid window that some stuff could coalesce pretty quickly, or are we kind of in the early days of experimenting? It could be
I think
5 years more.
Government and quickly are terms that don't usually go together. But which is a shame, because government can play such an enormous role. And I do think that while it's very easy and popular to rag on government, it does an enormous amount of good in our society. Even the most staunchly libertarian who think government should be out of everything, they're quite happy to use the roads. They're quite happy to, have regulated airwaves. I think that we have an education system. You can go to a country without government, and it doesn't look very good. And I like to say government is us. It's a mechanism for collective action. And so the question is, how do we make it more responsive? How do we make it more effective? And that's a lot of what we work on at Code for America. It's like, okay, you have policies. Do they work? How do you make them work? And what we all saw on display with the failure of healthcare.gov was that you can have the best policy in the world, and if you can't implement it, it doesn't do you any good. And the fact that the government couldn't actually build a website, even though they threw $1 billion at it, is criminal. And I think what we really have to do is we have to get better at government. We don't need less government. We just need more effective government. I think if you look actually the share the taxes as a share of GDP is pretty constant over decades. This notion that government has been growing is wrong. But what is the case is that government collects way more money than it should and doesn't do as much with it as it could. If you look at one of the things the private sector is good at is getting really good at being efficient with with things because there's creative destruction, whereas government doesn't really have that. So there needs to be a discipline of government getting better at what it does. And technology has taught some amazing lessons about how to build services at scale that get better as people use them. And I think we need to take some of those lessons from technology about how you instrument services, how you measure, how you constantly improve, and take those into government. And that's, again, what we're doing at Code for America.
But again, potentially...
And other groups like United States Digital Service.
But do you feel... So I see what you're saying. I totally get the long term on that. But I'm just thinking, it feels out there, and some people we've been talking to in this series have been talking about there's a couple-year window where bad regulation, bad categorization of workers as this or that.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of stuff could go wrong in the next few years that would set this back. On the other hand, if we did it right, it could actually propel the positive things forward. Is that your feeling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, it ranges from, movements like portable benefits, which are a different approach to the safety net. I was just talking with a guy from the UK who was also talking about how do we build better marketplaces for connecting people to work that's effectively occasional work. Apparently they've built a system in the UK, and the US has this great workforce training system that, they spend, a huge amount of money on, but it's really only for, quote, jobs. And again, that sort of pivot that we need is from jobs to work, what work needs doing. Again, that's one of those crucial next economy, pivots that I see. How do we stop talking about jobs, start talking about work? How do we stop talking about, getting rid of people, start talking about how to augment people? How do we start talking about, the legitimate aims of public policy rather than just sort of, having people do these things which are really, not in the interests of society as a whole. And how do we have a robust discussion about what those goals ought to be? And I think, there's a certain role for that kind of antagonism, that, we have a society that values sort of the butting of heads to get to truth. And, whether it's through the legal system or whether it's through just, public policy, lobbying and so on. But we also, I think we could do a lot better at creative engagement, and I think there's some really wonderful opportunities. We think about Airbnb, great. What kind of city do we want to build? And what makes it a good place to live? What can we learn? And there should be massive amounts of data sharing. Nobody should be writing rules yet. They should be, they should be writing the smallest possible rule set while they figure out what's going on, and be focusing on, well, what's really happening and how does it relate to what we wish was happening, but think about drones, and all that's, possible there. You think about, self-driving cars. I mean, you think about, just employment and the nature of employment. All of these things are going through these massive technological transformations. And if we have regulations that are only backward looking, that try to make things look like they used to look, that don't actually sort of say, let's take a fresh look at what we're trying to accomplish as a society, we're really missing a huge opportunity.
And so I guess my last question, or about the last question here, you said you're an optimist in the beginning there. How optimistic are you that this will play out with a backdrop here of the conventions and polarization in the country and all the different things we know here? But are you optimistic that this is going to move ahead? Or tell us, how optimistic are you, or how pessimistic are you where we are?
There was a wonderful piece in The Atlantic recently called "In Praise of Short-Term Thinking." And what it was like, you can believe in the long term, but you still have to worry about disruption in the short term. And, and that we have to be proactive at looking for that disruption. So I guess I would say I'm incredibly optimistic about the long term. Just as going back to what I said earlier, those people in Ned Ludd's rebellion couldn't imagine what the descendants of those machines would do for our society in making us all so much richer than even the richest aristocrats of their day. And we should be thinking the same way about our future. Oh my God, these new technologies, what will they make possible? What could we do if we took all this technology and said, wow, let's go reinvent everything. Instead of just saying, well, we're just going to optimize to, I mean, it's again, I keep going back to Uber. Like, they had this brilliant insight on how they could use technology to do this thing that was previously impossible. They built this great company. And then they start talking about, no, well, now we're just going to get rid of the drivers. Why aren't they talking about their flu shot, experiment? Like going, well, in 2014, we gave flu shots on demand, where we delivered a nurse. Like with self-driving cars, think about all the other things that could be on demand. Yeah, sure, the drivers won't be there anymore, but there'll be all kinds of other new kinds of services that could be on demand. What an amazing future. Let's get up freaking optimistic about all those things that are possible. Zipline in Rwanda, they're going, there's no roads, there's no hospitals, but guess what? We can use drones to deliver blood on demand to women who are dying. Postpartum hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of death. We can get blood there, anywhere in the country. Bang! Drop it with a parachute from a drone. It's like, holy shit. We can get medications out. That's like, let's rethink the world using today's technology. And so that fundamental optimism of how much possibility there is. What will AIs help us to do? What kinds of creative worlds will we see in virtual reality? Just like we're in the age of Hollywood. What's that going to look like when we're able to make these world-spanning visions? And oh my gosh, there's so much ahead of us, and we just have to kind of, I think, so that fundamental optimism about, this is amazing. Let's get there, and let's stop optimizing for the short term. Let's start optimizing for the long term. Let's think about how to make the society that we want. Let's harness technology to do the impossible. And I think, I guess I would just sort of say, one of the things, that history teaches us is that government plays an enormous role in that process. And our current distaste for and distrust of government is part of the problem. We have to get rid of that. We have to actually understand how to make government work again. Because when government works, it really becomes a governor for society. It helps, moderate the excesses. It helps, deal with market failure, both on the upside and on the downside. And we're going to need everything we've got. We're going to need government. We're going to need technology. We're going to need everybody on this planet to pull together to solve some of the challenges we've got in the years ahead.
Perfect place to end. On an optimistic note. And I loved your theme of reinvention, which is something that obviously here at Reinvent we're totally into. So, a fantastic interview, really laid it out from the big picture to the granular, and I didn't expect anything less from Tim O'Reilly, and I really appreciate you coming here.
All right, thank you. All right, this is fun.